Here's a look at the current average price of a home in Canada, $720,850. That's up 20% from last year. A think tank out of Vancouver is proposing a solution to this crisis, a new tax on homes worth over $1 million. Paul Kershaw is the founder of Generation Squeeze. He's in Vancouver. Paul Kershaw, thanks for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's nuts and bolts this a little bit. Can you walk us through how you see this tax working?
Well, just like governments have introduced a price on pollution to lower our emissions and tackle climate change, our report is recommending putting a modest price on housing inequity to apply a downward pressure on these skyrocketing housing prices that have landed us in this unaffordability crisis. And as you mentioned at the top, we're proposing to add a small surtax, less than 1%, on the value of homes over $1 million. So imagine you owned a $1.2 million home. It would be about $400 a year. You wouldn't have to pay it until the home was sold, and 90% of Canadians wouldn't pay a penny more, because only 10% of Canadians live in households above $1 million. I know that's hard to believe in the GTA and Metro Van, but that's what the data tell us.
Well, then, taking the GTA and Metro Van out of it, how would it work in markets in the country where the average price, the prices are still under $1 million, but where they're not affordable for so many people, where that's still an issue?
Yeah, so our policy is not a panacea. It is one more tool that we need to think about. And I guess the bottom line is that our housing system is tolerating home prices rising beyond local earnings because we are conflicted about what we want from home prices. Do we want them to stall so that housing is affordable and earnings can catch up? Or do we want them to continue to rise because people treat housing as a good investment? And the problem is that our policies incentivize us to treat it as a good investment because there's a home ownership tax shelter. Let me describe that for you. When you've gone to work today, 100% of what you earn is going to be taxed. If you invest some of those earnings in the stock market, 50% of your returns on investment will be taxed. But by contrast, the wealth anyone gains in their principal residence, somebody like me, is going to be barely taxed at all. And I should know, because BC Assessment just told me last year while I was sleeping, the equity in my home went up $500,000. And when we do that, when we have that kind of tax shelter, it works just like an offshore tax shelter. That offshore tax shelter motivates Canadians to move money out of Canada to preserve assets. We think that's a bad thing. But the home ownership tax shelter motivates us to bank on high and rising home prices to gain wealth. And the moment our policies incentivize us to do that, it gets Canadians hoping home prices might continue to rise. And that then results in crushing affordability for those who follow in our footsteps.
What do you say to those who say, a new tax isn't the answer? The problem is supply, and that's where all the energy ought to be going to deal with the sort of out of control prices.
I would say it's not either or thinking. We absolutely need to increase supply. And indeed, with the dollars that we're proposing to raise, about $500 billion a year, we would be allocating that to increase the supply of deeply affordable cooperative housing, deeply affordable purpose-built rental housing, because more and more, that's the kind of housing that we need to build for those who are being priced out of home ownership. So it's not either or. And for that matter, I'd also add, we need to think about how our monetary policy and our interest rates are fueling a really hot housing market. Just because we're talking about tax policy in this particular interview doesn't mean it's the silver bullet. It's one of many things we need to do, but this issue is kind of a third rail issue. And that's why we're pushing hard on it in this particular moment. We are begging Canadians to lean into the idea that if you're a senior in Fredericton right now, and you're being taxed on your pension income in the same way that a Vancouver senior is being taxed on her pension income, and we're treating you identically pretty much. But the person in Fredericton hasn't seen their home price go up all that much, whereas this retiree in Vancouver has seen their home value go up hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And we're not distinguishing between that. If I were the retiree in Atlantic Canada, I'd be frustrated. And our policy can help address that issue and put a downward pressure on these skyrocketing home prices.
What do you say to politicians who don't like to raise taxes, who don't want to go anywhere near that third rail?
I understand that. Actually, in this case, we're less competing for the attention of politicians at this particular moment and more for the hearts and minds of Canadians. Because unless Canadians create enough political cover for politicians to act courageously in response to this maddening, growing gap between home prices and earnings, we will never slow down these skyrocketing home prices, and we will not restore affordability forever. And I don't know which grandparent or parent wants to leave that kind of legacy for their kids and grandchildren. I'm in the business right now saying we want this country to have hard work pay off. Hard work did pay off back in the day when a bus driver or a nurse could actually get into owning their own home. But that was a few decades ago, and so much has changed. Now hard work and a master's degree is likely to mean you're going to struggle to pay rent a lot of the time, especially in our bigger cities. I think our country should want to reward hard work, and to do that, we need to protect access to real shelters more so than they're wanting to protect tax shelters.
I take your point that there's no silver bullet, and that this is your idea is one tool in the toolbox kind of thing. What is the risk? You've hinted at this. I mean, if there is no action on this problem. I mean, I know people who have written off the idea of ever owning. Are we looking at generation upon generation of people just not ever being able to afford their own home?
Yeah, a generation squeeze is a force for generational fairness. We tend to really attract a younger demographic. And too often now, I mean, I'm not out that old, but I've been in the housing market now for almost 2 decades. And I hear people who are just as smart as me and working just as hard as me and who have lots of education who are saying they can't imagine home ownership. Not even a single detached house, but even owning a townhome. They can't imagine it. How did our country let that happen? We've let it happen in part because politicians aren't wanting to lead so much on this issue. And let me single out one right now. Mr. Poilievre earlier this week said something really important. He said that the rising housing inflation is actually creating an aristocracy in this country. What a bold word, what a really provocative term. And I think in many respects, his analysis is right. Now he's wanting to politicize that and say, Prime Minister Trudeau is the problem in giving rise to this housing inflation. But I think it's a bad tactic because he's not acknowledging then many homeowners should be voting for whomever is causing their wealth to continue to skyrocket. But we then need the Prime Minister to say, no, he knows that these skyrocketing home values are problematic for a younger demographic that he badly wants to attract in terms of electoral politics down the road. That's what we need to try and create some space for a reasonable conversation and not simply say that tax policy as it relates to housing cannot be talked about in this country because it is crushing affordability and it is making inequality rampant. And I think it should be annoying the retiree in Atlantic Canada and prairie provinces by comparison with what's happening in our biggest cities in Ontario and BC.
Gosh, it's a daunting, tough problem, but that was a great conversation about possible solutions. Thank you, Paul.
Bring me back. I know there's going to be many of your listeners who hate the idea and they're going to send me angry emails and angry phone calls. I'd love to take that on more because there's so much more to unpack here. And remember, only 10% of people are going to face this issue. 90% wouldn't pay a penny more. I don't know how we can't build enough of a groundswell to build the political cover required to make this possible.
Paul Kershaw, thanks for your time.
Best. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.